In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Old World Blue. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this. Looking at the color, this is certainly a teal or turquoise leaning blue, without a doubt. It does work to its advantage here. It really helps it to not just be like all the other blues that are out there in the massive sea of blue inks. There's a lot of tone variation that you're going to get from this depending on what pen you put it into, and it definitely brings the shading almost all the time. Of course, we deal with some cheaper paper issues, but that's besides the point. I think in a professional environment, though, if you need a blue, you should avoid this. And that's because that very teal leaning never really goes away. So to be safe rather than sorry, having them thinking you're using a different color and going, no, but look at the bottle. I wouldn't use this in a professional environment. Does it mean that I wouldn't use it? Absolutely not. I think this is an incredibly beautiful color on the page, and when you can look back at what you write and have moments where you can see the strokes without a problem because of the shading and a beautiful tone, it is very nice to do. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pilot Vanishing Point with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, this is an incredibly light tone. We don't get any feather, we don't get any spread. We do get some spots of shading. It doesn't show up as much in the beginning, but as the pen's writing, when you hit the third, fourth, and fifth line of writing, it's definitely showing quite a bit of it. Not as much as I would like, and it does maintain it being there much better with other nibs, and we're going to get to see that. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than the soft fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get some very cool shading in what's going on, and I love the way this is looking in that shading. It is absolutely gorgeous, without a doubt. I don't know if I can say much more for that. Looking at the music nib, it is by far the darkest tone on the page. Now, we mostly get a lot of this very dark teal blue, and it shades, so I'm going to tell you, if I could get it shading in this tone from a round nib, I would be in absolute heaven. I don't write with a stub a whole bunch. This is a gorgeous tone on the page. It's not what I go for all the time, but this, it is standout. Very nice. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, just great performance.
To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib. A Platinum 3776 with a broad nib. A Platinum 3776 with a music nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad.
Looking at the soft fine nib, what we get is a little bit, just a tiny bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread. I think the shading here is showing itself a little bit nicer than we had on the Clairfontaine. A little more frequently, I really should say. It's doing very well, but this paper has tend to have done pretty well with most of the inks. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than we had with the soft fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get a very nice shading, especially on that center line when you see the and tortoise. I'm really liking what I'm seeing right there, and it is just wow as a color, really, and I don't tend to run towards teal or turquoise leaning inks. Looking at the music nib, it is beautiful in tone, just right off the bat. It is, in general, quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine or the broad. We're getting minor moments of feathering that are going to occur. If you really look at the cross in the T of interval on the second line, you see a little bit of it. Nothing to really be a problem. There's no spread, and the shading is, well, wow. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and another great performance. Unlike me recording, which is always dull.
I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we have very close to the same tone as from the Clairfontaine. Now we're getting no feathering, we're getting no spread, we're getting no shading. We are seeing barely any of that kind of teal turquoise lean. Mostly what we're getting is that blue, and it does look very nice. I think this is doing very well here. I'm incredibly impressed, if you haven't been able to tell. Looking at the broad nib, it's quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It does offer some moments of shading. If you look at the top line, the word have starts darker and gets lighter. Done starts lighter and gets darker. So it's definitely there, and it shows up in a bunch of the words. This shades very well even on the more absorbent papers. Looking at the music nib, it is by far the darkest tone on the page. We get tiny feathers that are occurring. Now, I'm just saying they are occurring and they're there. You look at the first word is definitely there. You look at represented. You see on the second part of the word a bunch of tiny feathers. Not something that's going to stop you from really being able to use this. So don't worry about it. There's no spread, and the shading still strong, still doing a great job. Looking at the back of the page, you can see, especially with the music nib, there was a lot of areas where the ink got deep into the paper. However, none of this bled through and touched the page underneath, and the ghosting is so under control, it shouldn't be a problem using the back of the page.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a similar tone that what we've had in the previous writing samples. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get almost no shading. You are going to see on the fourth line, and depending, a little bit of shading show up. And on the fifth line, a little bit of shading, but for the most part, really, it's not there. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than we had with the soft fine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get shading in every single word. This looks really good with this paper, which is much more absorbent by nature than a lot of papers I normally use. This performance in this notebook has really been selling me on it. Looking at the music nib, it is by far the darkest tone on the page. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get some shading. When you're looking at the top line on indicated, it's a very dark the whole way through, but the D looks a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Like the bottom part of the F for the F of T is a bit darker than the rest of what's going on. So there are some darker spots, though I don't really want to count on this in seeing shading here. Looking at the back of the page, we see that the ghosting is well under control. You can easily use the back of the page, and we got no bleeding touching the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Andrew Carnegie Steel Blue. Here is Colorverse Supernova. Here is Mont Blanc JFK. Here is Pen BBS number 181. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, this is the darkest tone that we've gotten from that pen with this ink. We get a little bit of feathering and spread in the beginning of the writing, but as the writing moved forward and I was writing a bit faster, the feather and spread was much more under control. So if you're going to be a very fast writer, I guess you could do this. Now we actually do get a couple of moments that are darker, so we can say that it is shading some. Looking at the broad nib, quite a bit darker than we had with the fine. Quite a bit more of that teal or turquoise tone coming through on it with this paper as well. More, I think, than some of the other papers. We're not getting a ton of feathering. There's just a little bit. When you see function in the bottom of the F, there's some there. When we look at as on the second line, there's a little bit there. Not so bad. The spread, that's minor, it's under control, and we are even seeing a little bit of shading, which is a bonus here. Looking at the music nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the broad. It is still really showing that kind of turquoise lean to it. It does feather quite a bit. It does spread quite a bit. Neither of those two things have been a surprise for this paper. More surprised that it didn't happen too much before. Now, as far as shading, there are a couple of spots that are a little bit darker, but I don't want to call it shading, but maybe I paused for just a second while writing. Looking at the page underneath, there was a massive amount of bleed through that touched the page underneath. I guess you could use it if you really wanted to, or you could said trombone. And you see why, looking at the back of the page, with the tremendous amount of ghosting, there's no using the back of this paper.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Thornton's Pink. Here is Sailor Kin Mokusai. Here is Private Reserve Plum. Here is Diamine Amber. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, the tone's not too far off of what we've seen with a bunch of the other papers. We get a tiny bit of feathering way under control and looking really good for this paper. We get the most minuscule amount of spread. Again, way under control for this paper, doing an especially good job. We're not getting any shading, but the fact that we're not having any real feather or spread issues, that's the good side. Looking at the broad nib, it feathers continuously all over. It makes woolly letters. It doesn't feather, it wools the letters. It spreads, but the spread is fairly under control. It's not spreading out of control. There is no shading whatsoever, and we're getting much more of that turquoise color than we are of the blue. So really be aware of that for your professional environments. Looking at the music nib, it is about the same tone as the broad. It feathers, not unexpected. It spreads, not unexpected. It doesn't shade, also not unexpected, so it's predictable, but predictably bad. Looking at the page underneath, you see a ton of spots that I circled that it came through even from the soft fine. And when we see the back of the page, we see the tremendous amount of ghosting. You can't use the back of the page. This is not good for this paper.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.